Welcome to Lo-Fi Stories. I'm Harry, your quiet guide for tonight's mystery. Before we begin, take a deep breath, and tell me where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. The Lady from the Locked Room. Chapter 1, The Letter That Waited Too Long. Some stories linger in the quiet folds of memory, not for their triumph, but for the shadows they leave behind. The case of the lady from the locked room was one such tale, and it began not with a knock at our door, but with a letter that had waited far too long. It was the spring of 1891, and London was heavy with mist and melancholy. I returned late to Baker Street after a long day at the surgery, exhausted, soaked from the rain, and craving nothing more than my chair by the fire. Holmes was seated cross-legged on the rug, eyes closed, violin untouched beside him. "Are you alive or just dramatically still?" I asked, peeling off my wet coat. He spoke without opening his eyes. Merely observing. "The atmosphere has shifted." "And what, pray, does that mean?" He gestured to the mantel. "A letter. Misplaced until today." Curious, I picked up the envelope, its seal broken and edges curled with time. The paper was yellowed, and a faint scent of lavender lingered. I read the inscription, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street." The date? 3 weeks past. "Holmes," I muttered, "this is old." "Why now?" He opened his eyes. "Because now is when it needs to be read." I unfolded the letter. "Mr. Holmes. If this reaches you, I beg for your discretion. Something is terribly wrong at Greystone Manor. My sister, Eliza, has locked herself away. She won't speak, and the door is bolted from within. Yet, the candles move. Please come. I fear for her mind, or her soul. Cordelia Winfield. Greystone Manor, Shropshire." Holmes was already on his feet, energized by the mystery. "Pack lightly, Watson. The train to Shropshire departs in 2 hours." I stared at him. "So we're chasing whispers and flickering candles now?" He turned, eyes gleaming. "We're chasing the unknown. Isn't that why you never stay away long?" The countryside passed in a blur of dark hedgerows and flickering oil lamps. Holmes was quiet on the journey, staring out the window with a far-off look. When I asked what he made of the letter, he simply said, "It's not the words that disturb me. It's what's left unsaid." We arrived in Shropshire near midnight. A black carriage awaited us, driven by an older man who said nothing as we climbed in. Greystone Manor stood atop a lonely hill, half-choked in fog. Ivy clung to its stone face, and the tall chimneys rose like fingers through the mist. Waiting in the doorway was a woman wrapped in black. "Miss Cordelia Winfield?" Holmes asked. "Yes. Thank you for coming." Her voice was thin and weary. Inside, the manor was still, too still. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something like antiseptic and damp cloth. Shadows stretched across the floor as we followed her deeper into the house. "She's upstairs," Cordelia whispered. 12 days now, locked away. No food, no fire. We hear her talking. And we've seen things." "What kind of things?" I asked. "Candles moving. Whispers. Once, a mirror cracked on its own." Holmes's face showed no fear, only fascination. "Who else lives here?" "My uncle Septimus. The housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway. And Annie, the maid. But Annie won't go near the room anymore. She led us up the stairs. At the far end of the corridor stood a heavy door with 2 brass locks. A note was pinned to it. "Do not enter. She is not alone." Holmes bent down, inspecting the edges, sniffing the faint wax in the keyhole. "Someone burned camphor recently. To cover a scent, perhaps. Do you intend to open it?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. Not tonight. She speaks only at midnight. We'll wait. Will you need rooms prepared?" Holmes straightened. "Yes. And leave the house as it is. I want to hear what she says." Cordelia nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe in ghosts?" Holmes paused, then answered gently. "I believe the past never stays buried. It waits. And sometimes, it knocks." Chapter 2, Greystone Manor. The road to Greystone was one of silence and stones, lined with old trees whose limbs bent like watchful sentinels, arms half raised in a warning they'd long grown tired of giving. The manor came into view just as the clouds parted above, revealing a slice of the moon like an unblinking eye. The place seemed not built but grown from the hilltop itself, as though it had always been there, waiting. The driver said nothing as he pulled up the drive. When Holmes stepped down from the carriage, he paused, not for breath or for words, but for stillness. He often did that at the threshold of a mystery, as though listening for what the house itself might tell him. Cordelia Winfield stood in the doorway, a tall figure wrapped in dark wool and worry. Her face was pale, yet there was a fire in her eyes that had not gone out, not entirely. "You arrived sooner than expected," she said. "We came as soon as we read your letter," Holmes replied. "Though I regret it waited as long as it did." Cordelia didn't answer that. She simply stepped aside and let us in. The interior of Greystone Manor was not what I expected. It bore none of the polished pride of English estates. Instead, the air hung heavy, as if each room still remembered something terrible. The hearth in the drawing-room was cold. The furniture, though elegant, was draped in sheets. Only one oil lamp burned, casting long, restless shadows across the walls. Holmes said nothing as he crossed the hall, fingers trailing along a faded wallpaper pattern. The wooden floor beneath his shoes creaked in soft complaint. "She is upstairs," Cordelia said quietly. "And has been, since the 7th of this month." "Almost 2 weeks," Holmes murmured. "And you say the door is locked from within?" Cordelia nodded. "Yes. We've tried to force it open, but it would not yield. Not even my uncle's key worked." "Your sister, Eliza, how has she been in the past? Before all this?" Cordelia paused, and her answer came like someone reciting a memory through fog. "She was quiet. Gentle. A woman of letters, not nerves. She read poetry aloud each morning. And now—" She trailed off. Holmes gently pressed, "You mentioned she writes things?" "Yes," Cordelia whispered. "We've slipped paper under the door. When it returns, it's filled with symbols. Ramblings. One day she wrote a single line, again and again, 'She waits behind the mirror.'" Holmes tilted his head. "And what makes you believe she is not alone?" Cordelia turned slowly toward the staircase. "Come. It's best if you see for yourself." We ascended the stairs in silence. The upper corridor was colder, physically, yes, but also spiritually, if such a thing can be said. The portraits on the walls were draped in black cloth. The floorboards here were narrower, warped slightly by time and weather. At the far end stood the door. It was made of oak, darkened by age, with two solid brass locks bolted firmly from the outside. A faint ring of soot circled the bottom edge, like smoke had once tried to escape. Holmes examined the handle first, then the hinges. "You say it's locked from within. Have you any idea how?" "There is a slide bolt," Cordelia replied. "Eliza installed it herself months ago. We didn't think anything of it then." "Was she frightened?" "She said it was for privacy." She had grown, withdrawn. Holmes crouched before the threshold. He produced a small envelope from his coat, spilling out a pinch of powder which he dusted along the frame. Then, with great care, he lit a match and held it low. The flame danced, then flickered sharply. "Camphor," he said softly. "Someone burned it here recently." "For the scent?" I asked. "Perhaps. Or to mask another." He gestured for us to step back and withdrew a magnifying glass from his satchel. He examined the keyhole, the threshold, the very grain of the door itself. Finally, he straightened. "There are scratches along the inside edge. Clawing marks, but faint. As though made with a button or pin." Cordelia's voice dropped. "We hear her at night. Speaking. Sometimes crying. But mostly, listening." "Listening?" Holmes repeated. "To someone. Or something. We don't know." At that moment, the wind outside picked up, causing a low whistle through the narrow corridor. The house creaked, not in decay, but as though shifting in its own sleep. Holmes placed a hand flat against the door. "Miss Winfield, I will not open this tonight. But I must hear her voice." "You said she speaks at midnight?" "Yes," Cordelia said. "Always then. Never before. Never after. Then Watson and I shall wait." She gave us a long, searching look, then nodded and turned away. Holmes and I remained in the corridor after the house had gone still. Midnight approached with the slow inevitability of the tide. As the clock in the drawing room struck 12, a sound stirred behind the locked door. It was a whisper, soft, but unmistakably human. "She's here, she watches me, don't let her out." I glanced at Holmes. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with recognition. "Eliza?" I called gently. "Can you hear me?" But the voice stopped. All we heard was our own breathing, and then, nothing. Holmes lit a candle and dripped wax across the floor just outside the door. Into the wax, he placed a strand of fine thread. "If that door opens," he said quietly, "we will know." We returned to our rooms, though I doubt either of us slept. The manor itself seemed to hold its breath. I could not shake the sound of that voice, low, trembling, terrified. Holmes was right. We weren't chasing ghosts. We were chasing something worse. Chapter 3: The Midnight Voice. Night at Greystone Manor did not fall so much as it seeped in, slowly, heavily, until every corner seemed to withdraw into shadow. The oil lamps flickered as though bothered by thoughts they could not shake, and somewhere in the east wing, an old grandfather clock ticked like a heartbeat too close to silence. Holmes and I took our places just outside the locked door where Eliza Winfield remained hidden. The corridor was narrow and cold, as though the warmth of the day had refused to climb the stairs. Holmes sat cross-legged against the wall, his notebook resting on his knee. I leaned near the door, listening. Midnight drew near. Every creak of the old house, every moan of the wind against the shutters, seemed louder in that hour. Somewhere below, the fireplace let out a sigh of smoke, and the housekeeper's cat padded softly across the wooden floor. Then, with the arrival of the 12th chime, it began. A voice. At first, barely a whisper, like the sound of parchment brushing against the floor. Then a word, or part of one. And then unmistakably, a woman's voice speaking just beyond the door. She's here, she watches me, always watching. It wasn't a cry for help. Nor was it the incoherent babble of madness. It was something else entirely. Controlled, precise, yet full of terror. Holmes leaned forward, eyes bright in the lamplight. "Miss Eliza," he called gently. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I've come to help." No answer. Only the sound of soft movement. The creak of a floorboard. Then, the voice again. "She waits behind the mirror." I tried not to look. I tried. A long pause. Then 3 slow knocks, from the inside of the door. My breath caught. Holmes didn't move. "Eliza," I tried, "can you open the door? Are you in danger?" Silence. A soft scrape, like fingernails brushing wood. And then, nothing. Holmes stood, his face unreadable. He examined the wax thread he had set across the floor, still intact. "She didn't open the door," he murmured. "But she was right there." He nodded. "Yes. She's not gone. But she's not quite here either." We stayed outside her door until the clock struck 1. No further sound came from within. As we returned to our guest rooms, Holmes stopped at the base of the stairs and stared at a tarnished mirror that hung on the wall, a tall, warped thing with a spiderweb crack near the top. He examined it for several minutes before speaking. "Watson, do you recall what Cordelia wrote? She waits behind the mirror." "I do," I said cautiously. Holmes tapped the glass. "A curious phrase. Superstitious? Perhaps. Or perhaps something more metaphorical. Something Eliza believes she sees." I joined him in front of it. My reflection looked tired, older than it had the day before. Behind us, the corridor stretched like a dark tunnel. And in that moment, for no logical reason, I felt watched. "Holmes," I whispered, "do you believe she's hallucinating?" He didn't answer right away. "I believe," he said finally, "that she's afraid of something she can't explain. And whether it's real or imagined doesn't change its hold on her." The next morning, the manor felt colder still. Breakfast was served in a dining room that hadn't been used in years, judging by the dust on the curtain ties. Cordelia joined us, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. She spoke again, Holmes said between sips of tea. Cordelia nodded. "She always speaks at midnight. It's like clockwork." "Has she always mentioned the mirror?" he asked. Cordelia hesitated. "Yes, ever since the first night she locked herself in. She said the mirror wasn't just showing her face anymore. That it showed someone else." "Someone else?" I asked. "She wouldn't describe her. Only that she was wrong somehow. That her mouth moved but made no sound." Holmes set his cup down with care. "Where is this mirror now?" "It's in the room. The one she locked herself in. Above the fireplace." Holmes's gaze drifted to the ceiling. "I'd like to see the other mirrors in this house." Cordelia frowned. "Why?" Because sometimes, Holmes said softly, a house doesn't just reflect its people. Sometimes it remembers them. We spent the day examining each room, every mirror, every hall. Holmes was meticulous. He measured distances, noted lighting angles, traced his fingers along the frames and backs of the glass. He asked about family members long gone, especially Cordelia and Eliza's childhood. We had a sister, Cordelia confessed at last, voice low. Isabel. She died when we were 9. She drowned in the pond at the edge of the estate. I see, Holmes said gently. And Eliza, did she witness it? Yes. She saw everything. There was a silence. The kind of silence that hangs after a bell has tolled. She was never the same afterward, Cordelia admitted. Not completely. But this is something else. Holmes nodded. Thank you. That helps. I didn't understand what he meant until later. That evening, Holmes and I sat once more outside the locked door. Midnight drew near again, and I braced myself for another whisper from the other side. But this time, no voice came. No knock. No sound. Only silence. Holmes frowned. She's listening tonight. Listening to what? I asked. He looked at the ceiling again, then down the corridor. To us, he whispered. Or to something else entirely. Chapter 4, The Broken Diary. The morning after the silence, Greystone Manor seemed heavier somehow, as if the house itself had taken offense at being ignored. The corridors were darker, despite the weak sunlight filtering through the windows. Even the creaking floorboards beneath our feet groaned with more reluctance. Holmes did not speak during breakfast. He buttered his toast absently, his mind clearly miles away, likely within the locked room upstairs, reconstructing scenes none of us had witnessed. I sipped tea, casting glances at Cordelia, who looked more frail than ever. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stirred her cup. She didn't speak last night, I finally said. Cordelia nodded. No. That's only happened once before. The third night. Holmes set his knife down. What happened the day after she fell silent? Cordelia's brow furrowed. I found her diary. That made Holmes look up. I didn't mean to pry, she continued. But I feared for her, and I hoped it might help. I found it under her mattress. The back cover was torn, and several pages had been, well, destroyed. Destroyed? I asked. She nodded. Ripped, slashed. As though she wanted them gone completely. May we see what remains? Holmes asked softly. Without a word, Cordelia rose and left the room. She returned moments later with a small leather-bound book tied shut with a ribbon. She handed it to Holmes with both hands, as though she were passing over something living. He opened it gently, revealing fine handwriting in brown ink. The earlier entries were neat, full of ordinary reflections, books read, conversations with Cordelia, the names of wildflowers spotted near the pond. But then the tone shifted. Holmes read aloud. I saw her again today. Not in dreams. In glass. She mouthed my name, but it didn't sound right. As if it belonged to someone else. Cordelia says I'm tired. But tiredness doesn't make the mirror whisper. I locked the door last night. But I heard footsteps behind me after I did. And I was alone. Holmes flipped ahead. Many pages were torn out, violently so. One page remained near the end, the ink jagged and uneven. She wants me to remember something. But I don't want to. I won't. If I forget, she fades. But if I remember, she returns. I think she's getting stronger. Cordelia's eyes glistened with tears. I don't understand it. Holmes closed the diary with care and held it a moment in his hands, as though weighing more than just paper. You said Isabel drowned, he said quietly. Yes, Cordelia answered. In the estate pond. Was Eliza close to her? They were inseparable. And after her death? Cordelia hesitated. She stopped speaking for nearly a year. Holmes stood and moved to the window. Outside, fog was rolling in from the woods beyond the manor, soft and slow like breath on glass. There is trauma buried here, he said. Not just grief, but something Eliza has kept hidden, even from herself. The mind protects what it cannot bear. But what does it mean? I asked. This talk of mirrors, of someone watching? Holmes turned. Watson, have you ever heard of the concept of a revenant? I blinked. You mean a ghost? Not quite, he said. A revenant is a memory, so strong, so unresolved, it refuses to fade. Not just in dreams, but in the waking world. It clings to objects, places, reflections. Especially if the trauma is tied to identity or guilt. Cordelia looked shaken. You think Eliza sees Isabel? I think, Holmes said gently, Eliza is haunted. But whether by a spirit, a memory, or her own fractured mind, we have yet to determine. He handed the diary back. This may help us. But we'll need to understand more. About what? Cordelia whispered. Holmes paused. About the night Isabel died. Later that day, we walked the grounds with Cordelia. The estate stretched far, rolling hills, tangled hedges, and a pond at the edge of a copse of trees. The water was still. Too still. It mirrored the gray sky above like a secret kept flat and shallow. She drowned here, Cordelia said, her voice hushed by the breeze. Eliza and I were playing hide and seek. Isabel ran too far. She wasn't supposed to go near the water. Holmes knelt by the edge, examining the reeds, the slope of the ground, the way the trees framed the bank. Was it ruled accidental? Yes, Cordelia said. She slipped. That's what everyone said. But you don't believe that, Holmes said. Cordelia hesitated, then whispered, sometimes. I don't know what I believe anymore. We returned to the manor in silence. That night, Holmes took up vigil again outside Eliza's door. I joined him after a while, bringing an extra lamp and a blanket. He glanced toward the sealed keyhole. She didn't speak last night because we disturbed something. Do you think she's aware of us? I think she knows we're close to something she's hidden. The diary changed things. We waited. Midnight came. No voice, but a new sound, faint, like scratching on the inside of the wall. Holmes stiffened. He rose silently and placed his ear to the door. Not the floor, he said. The mirror. The mirror? She's not speaking anymore, he whispered. She's drawing. Chapter 5, The History of Madness. The following morning arrived with low clouds and a breeze sharp enough to whistle through the cracks in the manor's aging windowpanes. I found Holmes already awake, standing before the drawing-room fireplace, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames as though they might whisper a solution. "She was drawing," he said without turning. "Last night." "Not speaking." "Drawing." "Are you sure it wasn't just the house settling?" I asked, still rubbing sleep from my eyes. He shook his head. "No." The sound was deliberate. Rhythmic. A fingernail against glass or slate. Not frantic, measured. Controlled. Holmes turned to me, his face pale with thought. "And there's only one surface in that room capable of producing that sound." "The mirror," I said quietly. He nodded. At breakfast, Cordelia entered more hesitantly than usual. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a small napkin. Inside was a folded paper. "This was under the door this morning," she said. Holmes took it and carefully opened the creased parchment. A charcoal drawing filled the page, rough and heavily shaded. It depicted a woman's face in profile, but her features were distorted. Her eyes were wide and staring, mouth agape. But where the ear should have been was a black spiral, drawn again and again until the paper tore slightly. "She waits behind the mirror," Holmes murmured, studying the scrawl at the bottom. Cordelia sat down with a weary sigh. "She didn't speak last night. But I heard her pacing. Back and forth. Then, laughter." "Laughter?" I asked. Cordelia nodded. "Not hers. Someone else's. A second voice. But only for a moment." Holmes looked at me. "A second voice. We're no longer dealing with just delusion, Watson. We may be confronting an echo." "An echo of what?" "Of something once heard, long ago." Holmes spent the afternoon in the manor's old study, poring over journals, ledgers, and letters from the attic archives. Dust clung to everything. Entire generations of Winfields had passed through these halls, and the paper trail of their presence whispered from cracked leather spines and yellowed paper. I joined him, helping wherever I could. By mid-afternoon, Holmes had arranged a dozen documents in chronological order, stretching across the length of the oak desk. "Madness," he said suddenly. "What about it?" "It runs in the family." He pointed to a weathered diary entry, dated 1821. It read, "Elizabeth Winfield, confined after claiming to hear her twin in the mirrors. Repeatedly scratched, I see her still, into the hearthstone. Died in sleep." Next to it, a letter from 1854. "Septimus Winfield writes of his sister and, she sees mother in the glass. Speaks to her at dusk. We've removed all mirrors from her room." Holmes straightened. "There is a pattern here. Female members of the family. A specific delusion, or belief, about mirrors as passageways or traps for the dead. A form of inherited psychosis?" I offered. "Possibly. But the consistency is too exact. Same imagery. Same language. You think it's more than madness?" He didn't answer. Instead, he drew a new timeline in his notebook, marking 3 dates, 1821, 1854, and 1875. Each incident happens roughly 30 years apart. Eliza started 2 weeks ago, on the anniversary of Isabel's death. I stared at him. "You think this, whatever it is tied to that?" "I think trauma was the match," he said quietly. "But the fuel has been here far longer." That night, Holmes asked Cordelia to gather the household, her uncle Septimus, the housekeeper Mrs. Holloway, and the maid Annie. We met in the drawing room. The fire crackled low. Shadows moved across the carved panels like smoke in human form. Holmes stood before them all. "I need you to think carefully," he said. "Has anyone in this household experienced strange phenomena in the past? Unexplained reflections? Sounds? Behavior changes?" Mrs. Holloway, a thin woman with knotted hands and thinning hair, glanced nervously at Septimus. Annie said nothing, eyes wide. Cordelia looked to her uncle. "Uncle Septimus?" The old man shifted in his chair. "This house has always had moods. Sounds. Whispers. But what manor of this age doesn't?" "That's not what I asked," Holmes said. There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Holloway spoke. "Miss Eliza used to sleepwalk when she was a girl," she said quietly. "Only ever on stormy nights. Always toward the mirror in the upstairs hall. I'd find her standing in front of it, eyes wide, lips moving, but no sound." Cordelia turned pale. "I never told you," the housekeeper went on. "Because she'd never remember. She'd just blink and ask why she was cold." "And Annie?" Holmes asked gently. "You've seen something too, haven't you?" The maid hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "I saw her face in the dining room mirror, only she wasn't there. I was alone. But she smiled." A chill crawled down my spine. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the staircase. "Watson," he said without looking back, "bring the toolkit. Tonight, we remove the mirror." We waited until well past midnight, when the house was asleep or pretending to be. Holmes and I ascended the stairs, toolbox in hand, our footsteps muffled by thick carpet and nerves. Outside Eliza's room, we paused. Holmes knelt, pressed his ear to the door. No voice. No movement. He rose, and with slow precision, unlatched the first of the exterior locks. "What if she wakes?" I whispered. "She won't," Holmes replied. "Not yet." He slipped a thin, hooked tool through the keyhole and worked in silence. A soft click. Then the door creaked inward half an inch before catching on the bolt Eliza had set from the inside. "She's still sealed in," he confirmed. "Good." Holmes then produced a slim mirror from his coat, a hand mirror from the guest room, and angled it beneath the door. He slid it gently forward. And froze. "What do you see?" I asked. He turned the mirror to me. What I saw was impossible. The room was dim, barely lit by moonlight. But in that reflection, on the wall opposite the fireplace, was the large mirror. And drawn across it, in black smudged strokes, was a single word. Isabel. Chapter 6, The Maid Vanishes. The next morning, the mood in Greystone Manor was different. It was not the silence that alarmed me, this house had long since made silence its companion, but the stillness, the sense that something had shifted in the very floorboards, that something beneath us had breathed once during the night and had not exhaled. Holmes was already up when I descended to the breakfast room. He stood by the window, cup of tea untouched on the sill, eyes following something beyond the fog. "She wrote Isabel's name," I said quietly, joining him. He nodded. "Yes. On the mirror, in her room." In complete silence, with the door bolted from within. "Have you considered how she could have done it?" "Yes," he said. "And I've discarded most of the possibilities." He finally turned to me. "Watson, it's not the writing that disturbs me. It's the precision. The charcoal strokes were careful. Intentional. Not the frantic scrawling of a madwoman. She wasn't losing her mind when she wrote that word. She knew exactly what she was doing. We said nothing more. There was nothing to add. Not until Cordelia entered the room moments later, her face pale, voice trembling. "Annie is missing." We followed Cordelia through the hall, past the staircase and into the narrow passage that led to the servants' quarters. The girl's room was small, only a bed, a chair, and a chipped wardrobe, but it was empty. "She didn't make her bed," Cordelia said. "She never forgets." Holmes opened the wardrobe. Clothes remained. Her slippers were still tucked neatly beneath the chair. He knelt by the bed, running his fingers along the floor. "Dust undisturbed," he murmured. "She didn't pack. Didn't leave. Then where could she have gone?" I asked. "She didn't go anywhere," Holmes said darkly. "She vanished." Cordelia's hands twisted in front of her. "She was terrified last night. After what you said in the drawing room. She told me she wouldn't go near Eliza's door. That she felt something, watching her." "Something?" I echoed. "She didn't have a name for it," Cordelia whispered. "She just said it was cold. Cold and angry." Holmes stood abruptly. "Where's the mirror from her room?" Cordelia blinked. "What? You said she saw something in the mirror. Where is it now?" "It was taken down years ago. After the first incident." "The first?" Cordelia nodded slowly. "She saw something. Not her own face. She ran from the room screaming and refused to sleep there for 2 nights. So we removed the glass." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Is that mirror still in the house?" I don't know. Maybe the attic?" Without another word, Holmes turned and strode toward the narrow staircase that led to the uppermost floor. The attic at Greystone Manor was not the dusty, forgotten storage space one might expect. It was orderly, catalogued, dozens of wooden crates, furniture under white sheets, trunks lined along the walls like coffins waiting for morning. Holmes moved quickly, scanning the room with methodical urgency. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a large object draped in canvas. We approached. He reached out and pulled the sheet away. A mirror. Tall, rectangular, framed in dark cherry wood. Its surface, though covered in a thin film of dust, was unbroken. Untouched. He stared into it. I did the same. Nothing stared back at us but our own tired reflections. "She saw something here?" I asked. Holmes nodded. It wasn't the mirror. It was what it held for her. He stepped closer and leaned in until his nose nearly touched the glass. "Memory," he whispered. "That's what this house is full of. Not spirits. Not phantoms. Just memory thick enough to breathe." I was about to speak when a sound interrupted us, a scream. Faint, distant. A woman's voice, echoing from below. "Cordelia." We raced down the stairs. We found her in the upstairs corridor, standing frozen before Eliza's door. "What happened?" Holmes asked. She's speaking again," Cordelia whispered, trembling. "But it's not her voice. It's not Eliza's voice." Holmes pressed his ear to the wood. We listened. At first, nothing but silence. Then, a murmur. Low and deliberate. "She took my name," and locked me out, but I remember. I always remember. Then, a second voice, higher, colder, layered beneath the first like wind beneath snow. Isabel. The sound chilled my spine. Cordelia clutched my arm. That wasn't Eliza. I swear it wasn't. Holmes stepped back. It wasn't. Or at least, it wasn't just her. He turned to me. Watson, bring the mirror from the attic. We returned with the tall cherry-framed glass. Holmes placed it opposite Eliza's door, angling it so that if the door were to open, the mirror would reflect whatever stood inside. He tied another fine thread of wax and ash across the floor, an invisible tripwire. Tonight, he said, we watch. And this time, we do not blink. That night, the house settled into a hush unlike the others. Not simply still, but expectant. The kind of quiet you feel beneath storm clouds, when the air is heavy with the weight of what's to come. Holmes and I sat cross-legged on the floor, backs against the cold wall. Across from us, the mirror. Beside it, the locked door. I watched the flame of the oil lamp dance. Midnight arrived. And then, the sound of the bolt inside the door sliding back. The door did not open. But the mirror. The mirror changed. In its surface, faintly, the reflection of the door rippled, and a second figure appeared. A girl. Standing behind the first. Eyes wide. Mouth open. Not moving. Not breathing. Then, in the glass, they both turned to look at us. I gasped. Holmes remained still as stone. She's showing us, he said. Showing us what? What was taken? What was hidden? The door never opened. But when we lit the lamp brighter, the mirror had changed again. The second figure was gone. Only Eliza remained. And on the floor, where Holmes's wax thread had been placed, it was snapped. Chapter 7, A Name in the Fire. The next morning dawned gray and windless, and the air inside Greystone Manor seemed to hang suspended, neither warm nor cold, neither still nor restless. Just waiting. Downstairs in the drawing room, the hearth was burning, though no one had lit it. Cordelia was the first to notice. She descended before either Holmes or I and found the fire already roaring when she entered. The embers were deep and red, with no sign of fresh logs, just heat radiating from ancient ashes, as though someone had stirred a memory back to life. She's trying to speak to us, Holmes said after examining the fireplace. Or perhaps not to us at all. Perhaps to someone who hasn't been here in a very long time. He reached into the flames with the iron poker, stirring them gently until a few sparks rose. Then, with a cloth over his hand, he pulled something small and blackened from beneath the grate. It was a curled edge of parchment, half-burned but intact enough to read. Holmes laid it on the stone hearth, smoothing it flat. There, in a shaky hand, written in charcoal or soot. She took my name. I remember the water. I remember the hand. I was not alone. Beneath it, one word, half-burned, but clear enough to make Cordelia step back in shock. Isabel. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Holmes said softly, "She didn't just drown." Cordelia's voice trembled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't a haunting, it's a reckoning." He turned the charred paper toward the light. "She's speaking about the night she died. Not metaphorically. Not as a delusion. As memory." Cordelia looked pale. "But, she was just a child." Children remember, Holmes replied. And when truth is buried too deep, it does not die. It waits. For the right moment. The right voice. I stepped forward. You think Eliza is channeling Isabel? I think Eliza is remembering what she buried for decades. But that memory, it may not entirely be hers. He tapped the word hand. I think there's more to the drowning. And someone in this house knows it. Later that day, we gathered again in the drawing room. Cordelia, pale and silent. Uncle Septimus, reluctant and stiff. Mrs. Holloway, wringing her hands. The maid, Annie, had still not returned. Holmes stood at the hearth, the burned note on the table beside him. I'll be direct, he said. We now know Eliza is responding to something internal and external. A traumatic memory has surfaced, but it carries details she should not recall. Meaning? Septimus asked, brow furrowed. Meaning she speaks as though she was Isabel, Holmes said. The tone, the phrasing, it's different. Not always, but enough to suggest, overlay. Mrs. Holloway crossed herself. Possession? Holmes shook his head. No. Not in the spiritual sense. But memory, when suppressed long enough, can fracture. And if a child bore witness to a tragedy and buried it beneath layers of silence and guilt, it may emerge later. Twisted. Shared. Cordelia whispered, You believe she saw what happened to Isabel? Holmes looked at her, then to Septimus. No, he said. I believe she was part of it. A long, terrible silence. Then Septimus stood slowly. That's a dangerous suggestion. It's not a suggestion, Holmes said. It's the only conclusion left. He picked up the parchment again. This note, half-burned, was left in the fire for us to find. Not destroyed. Preserved. It names someone. It describes the water. The hand. Cordelia's voice broke. But she was just a child. Yes, Holmes said gently. And that's why she's never spoken of it. Because even then, she didn't fully understand what happened. He turned to Septimus. Who was with them that day? The old man looked away. The girls were alone. Are you certain? Holmes pressed. I was told so. By whom? There was no answer. Holmes's voice dropped. There was a rumor, wasn't there? That Isabel didn't slip. Mrs. Holloway looked up sharply. There were whispers, but no one dared speak them. Not after the coroner ruled it accidental. Holmes faced Cordelia. What do you remember? Cordelia's eyes filled with tears. I don't, just fragments. Eliza screaming. Mother running. The doctor shouting orders. Isabel's hair tangled in reeds. She buried her face in her hands. Holmes stepped away from the hearth. Memory isn't linear, he said quietly. It returns in pieces. Smells. Words. Names. Then he turned back to the others. And sometimes, it returns in fire. That night, Holmes took his post again in the hallway. I sat beside him. Neither of us spoke. We waited. Midnight came. The lock on Eliza's door did not turn. The mirror remained still. But then, footsteps. Barefoot. Light. From within. And a voice. Young. Soft. She said I couldn't play near the water. But she didn't stop me. Another pause. She said she'd tell Mother, so I pushed her. Holmes looked at me. Not shocked. Prepared. The voice continued. She didn't float. I thought she would. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. Then silence. Utter, soul-deep silence. Cordelia's voice rose behind us. She had come quietly, unnoticed. She pushed her, she whispered, horrified. Holmes stood. No, he said gently. Eliza thinks she did. But I believe someone else was there. She's reliving it. She's trying to remember, Holmes corrected. But someone has made sure she never could. He looked down at the snapped wax thread on the floor. She's walking in her sleep now. Moving. But not escaping. I asked, should we open the door? Holmes stared at the mirror. No, he said. Not yet. She's close. If we open it now, we may destroy what little is holding her mind together. Cordelia's voice was barely audible. Do you think she's beyond saving? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he stared into the mirror once more, where only our three reflections stood. But in that moment, just before the lamplight flickered out, I saw a fourth. A small figure. Hair matted. Dress dripping. Eyes wide. Mouth open. Whispering from behind the glass. Chapter 8, The Room is Unlocked. The morning after we heard the confession, if that's what it was, the manor felt irreversibly altered. Not by movement, not by noise, but by presence. Something had been revealed. Something had shifted. Cordelia didn't come down for breakfast. Neither did Septimus. Mrs. Holloway appeared, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, and served tea with trembling hands. Holmes and I sat in the parlor, staring at the dying embers of a fire we hadn't lit. She's reliving a memory, I said finally. But whose? Perhaps both, Holmes replied. Perhaps the guilt is hers, and the truth belongs to someone else. Or perhaps the memory has been shared so long it's grown its own voice. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a slip of paper, a torn page from Eliza's diary, the one Cordelia had given us days ago. She waits behind the mirror. She is always behind it. Watching me remember. Watson, he said, we've treated this as a haunting or a psychological fracture. But what if it's a message chain? A memory loop echoing between two minds? You mean Eliza and Isabel? I mean the living and the dead, Holmes said calmly. Or at least, what remains of them. Before I could reply, Cordelia burst into the room, her face ashen, her breath short. She's opened the door. We followed her up the staircase in silence, every step ringing louder than it should have. The corridor was dark, save for the pale morning light creeping through a cracked window. Eliza's door stood slightly ajar, the brass locks Holmes had reinforced left dangling, untouched. She opened it herself, Cordelia whispered. It was like she'd finally decided to let us in. Holmes placed a hand on the door and slowly pushed it wide. The room was silent. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, as though no one had drawn breath for days. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, and a single oil lamp on the desk had burned itself out. Eliza sat in a wooden chair by the fireplace. Her posture was too still. Her face was turned toward the tall mirror on the opposite wall, its surface smudged, as though wiped by trembling hands. She did not look at us. "Miss Winfield?" I called softly. No answer. Holmes stepped forward, careful not to startle her. "Eliza," he said gently. "It's Sherlock Holmes. We're here to help you." She blinked. Her eyes were open. She was awake. But she wasn't here. Holmes knelt beside her and spoke softly. "Do you know where you are?" Her lips moved. A whisper. Barely audible. "Still here." Holmes leaned closer. "Who is still here?" She didn't speak again. But her hand slowly lifted, pointing toward the mirror. We turned. The mirror was no longer just glass. Across its surface, drawn in charcoal, were 3 names. Isabel. Eliza. Cordelia. And beneath them, one phrase repeated again and again. "She remembers. She remembers. She remembers." Cordelia stepped back, visibly shaken. I don't understand." "Why my name?" Holmes stood and examined the writing. "Because the memory wasn't buried alone. Guilt and grief are shared, whether we speak of them or not." He turned to her. "Do you remember what happened that day?" Cordelia shook her head. "No. I was with them. But it's always been blank." "I told you that." "Children forget things not because they're unimportant," Holmes said, "but because someone tells them to forget." He turned again to the mirror. And this time, he picked it up. Together, we moved the tall frame from the wall. Holmes gestured for me to hold it upright as he stepped behind it. He ran his fingers along the back edge, then pried gently at the lower frame. A small compartment opened with a quiet click. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a second diary. Not Eliza's. Isabel's. Cordelia gasped. "How did that get there?" Holmes unwrapped it slowly. The pages were stiff, aged, but legible. The handwriting more childish, rounder, messier. He flipped through, eyes scanning the lines until he found the final page. He read aloud. "I saw them fight. Eliza didn't want to play. But I said I'd go anyway. Cordelia told me not to run. She was angry. Then she pushed me. I don't think she meant to. I fell. It was cold. I couldn't breathe." Cordelia collapsed into the chair. "No," she whispered. "No, I didn't." Holmes closed the book gently. "You were only children," he said. "But you forgot. Both of you. Because you were told to." He looked toward the doorway. And Septimus Winfield stood there. Silent. Watching. Holmes walked toward him, slowly, like approaching a cornered animal. "You knew," Holmes said. "Didn't you?" The old man's eyes were hard. "It would have destroyed the family. So you let it destroy them anyway?" "She wouldn't have survived it. Either of them." Holmes's voice was quiet. "You lied. To them. To yourself. And now your house is crumbling under the weight of that lie." Septimus said nothing. Holmes turned back to Eliza. She didn't just hear voices. She was remembering what you told her to forget. What you buried in the walls of this house. Then he looked at Cordelia. "And so were you." We left the room in silence, letting the morning light flood the corridor behind us. Eliza had not spoken again, but she no longer stared into the mirror. She sat quietly now, hands folded in her lap, as if some storm inside her had finally begun to calm. Downstairs, Holmes placed Isabel's diary on the table. Cordelia stood beside it, staring down. "I didn't remember," she said quietly. "Not really." "Your mind protected you," Holmes said. "And hers tried to show you." She looked up. "What will happen now?" "That's for the three of you to decide," he said. "But if you leave that room locked forever, this house will never let it rest." She nodded slowly. Then whispered, "We'll open all the windows. Let the air back in." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. That would be a fine beginning. Chapter 9, What the House Remembers. Greystone Manor did not change overnight, but something beneath its skin began to breathe again. The doors no longer groaned with the weight of silence. The fireplaces no longer sputtered in confusion. And the mirrors were no longer covered, nor feared. It was Cordelia who took the first step. That very afternoon, she entered Eliza's room alone, sat with her sister in silence, and opened the window for the first time in years. The wind carried with it the scent of autumn leaves, wet stone, and something else, memory. Not the kind that claws, but the kind that lingers like music in a hallway. Holmes and I stood at the edge of the garden, overlooking the pond that had once stolen Isabel away. "She's begun to speak," Cordelia had told us earlier, voice trembling with hope. "Not clearly. Not often. But she said my name this morning. My name, Watson." Holmes watched the water ripple beneath the wind. "Eliza is not lost," he said. "She never was. She was buried. And now she's learning to rise." I nodded, then turned toward the manor. "Do you think the house is done remembering?" I asked. Holmes gave me a look I'd seen many times before, measured, unreadable, steeped in thought. "No house ever forgets," he said. "Especially one built on silence." That night, Holmes did something he rarely did in the midst of a case. He played the violin. Not for others. For himself. The sound rose through the empty halls like a bomb, drifting from the drawing room out through the open corridors, up the staircases, and beneath the doors that had once held voices trapped. I stood outside Eliza's door, listening. Through the gap, I saw her sitting at the desk. Her hands rested on an open page, her own diary, now filled not with fear, but fragments of thought. Single words. Names. Half-formed memories. It wasn't clarity yet, but it was the beginning of one. Holmes appeared beside me. "She's listening," he said. I nodded. "It soothes her. It speaks to what the house doesn't say." We spent the following day in the West Wing, an area previously sealed off due to disrepair. Dust blanketed everything, and the windows had gone opaque with grime. Holmes insisted on examining a small sitting room at the end of the corridor, one we hadn't visited before. Cordelia joined us, hesitant. "I haven't been in here since our parents died," she said, gently brushing cobwebs from the doorknob. The door opened with a brittle sigh. Inside, a piano, long untouched. Shelves of books, untouched for decades. And on the far wall, another mirror, cracked, slightly bowed, but whole. Holmes approached it at once. His fingers traced the inner rim of the frame, then the wallpaper behind it. He stepped back. "This one was moved," he said. "There are nail holes behind the plaster. It used to hang in Eliza's room, didn't it?" Cordelia blinked. "Yes. I think so." It saw something, he murmured. He turned to me. Watson, the night Isabel died, there were 3 girls in the garden. Yes. But afterward, 1 was buried, and 2 were rewritten. He touched the mirror gently. This house didn't just forget. It was instructed to. Every detail moved, every object realigned to erase the story. Cordelia lowered her eyes. Our mother couldn't bear it, she said. She told us it was better not to speak of it. That forgetting was a kind of forgiveness. Holmes looked up. Some stories don't want to be forgiven. That evening, Holmes requested one final act before our departure. He wanted the family, those who remained, to gather in the locked room. Not to confront Eliza, but to allow her to see them. To prove she was not alone. We met just after dusk. Cordelia entered first, her arm linked with Eliza's, who now walked, slowly but willingly. Septimus followed behind, his cane tapping softly with every step. Even Mrs. Holloway came, clutching a rosary she hadn't held in years. Holmes lit 3 lamps and placed them at the corners of the room. He faced the mirror. Eliza, he said gently, do you remember what you told me the first night I arrived? She didn't answer, but her head tilted slightly, as though listening. You said she waits behind the glass. He stepped aside, and the family stood behind him, reflected as one. You don't have to be afraid of her anymore. She's not angry. She's a memory. A piece of you. And she wants to be let go. Eliza blinked. Her hands clenched the arms of her chair. Holmes continued. You didn't kill her. Cordelia stepped forward. Neither did I. And then, for the first time in days, Eliza spoke. Her voice was dry, rusted with disuse, but clear. She fell, she said. Tears spilled from her eyes. She was reaching for the ribbon in the water. I tried to stop her. I was behind her. But Cordelia shouted. She looked to her sister. You said don't. And she turned. Cordelia's voice broke. And I ran. I ran back to the house. I thought I'd be blamed. Eliza nodded slowly. I tried to grab her hand. She raised her palm, open, empty. But it slipped. The room was silent but full. Not with fear. Not anymore. With memory. With release. Holmes stepped forward and touched the mirror. He reached into his coat and pulled out a cloth, then gently covered the glass. Let her rest now, he said. Eliza nodded. And for the first time since the door had been locked, she smiled. Chapter 10, The Final Reflection. Autumn deepened in Greystone Manor. The days grew shorter, the shadows longer, and yet, for the first time in decades, the house felt lighter. A quiet transformation had begun. Gone were the heavy drapes that once smothered every room in shadow. The doors no longer remained bolted. The windows were opened each morning, letting in the soft gold of October sun. The rooms breathed again. The air no longer smelled of secrets. Eliza began speaking regularly. Slowly, cautiously, but with growing strength. She spent time in the garden, sometimes sketching beneath the old willow tree by the pond. Once, she even let her hand drift across the water's surface. No one spoke of what had happened there, not in front of her, but no one needed to. The past no longer demanded to be shouted. It had been heard. It had been seen. And most importantly, it had been understood. Holmes and I stayed for 3 more days. Each morning, he observed. He walked the perimeter of the manor grounds, took notes near the fireplace where the first burned message appeared, and visited the locked room, now no longer locked. "Trauma leaves impressions, Watson," he said to me as we stood one last time in the upper corridor. "Like footprints on the floorboards. Cover them with carpets and silence, and they still remain." I nodded. "Do you think the house is cured?" He gave a soft chuckle. "Houses aren't cured. They're confessed." That's what this was, one long confession buried under generations of fear. And Eliza? She's still recovering. But she's no longer haunted by ghosts. Only by herself. And that, he added, is something all of us must learn to live with. Our final breakfast at Greystone was quiet, but peaceful. Eliza sat with us. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. Her eyes no longer darted nervously. Her hands no longer shook. And when Cordelia poured her tea, Eliza reached across the table and whispered, "Thank you." That single word felt like the final thread in a tapestry pulling tight. A seam closing. A wound beginning to scar. Later that morning, Holmes asked for a final walk through the West Wing. Cordelia joined us as we stepped into the old sitting room with the cracked mirror, the one that had once hung in Eliza's childhood bedroom. Holmes stood before it quietly. "There's one final thing this house must do," he said. He turned to Cordelia. "You must choose what to do with this." She looked at the mirror, then at us. "I want to keep it." Holmes raised a brow. "Not afraid?" She shook her head. "No. If it watched what happened, if it held those memories, then maybe it deserves to remain. But not as a threat. As a reminder." He nodded once. "Very wise." And with that, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the nearby table. A small ribbon. Faded lavender. Frayed at the ends. The ribbon Isabel had worn the day she died. Cordelia stared at it for a long time. Then whispered, "Thank you." We left Greystone that afternoon under a sky of pale blue and drifting clouds. The manor stood behind us, not as a place of horror, but of history. A story now told. As the carriage wheels crunched along the gravel, I looked back one last time. At the window of the room once locked. Eliza stood there. Watching us. And this time, when she raised her hand to wave, we waved back. That evening, in the comfort of our London rooms, Holmes poured 2 glasses of claret and sat by the fire, his violin leaning against the chair. "Well, Watson," he said with the faintest smile, "we were called for a ghost, and we found a graveyard of memories." "Indeed," I said. "Do you believe in hauntings now?" He considered this for a moment, then replied. "I believe in the persistence of pain. In the echo of guilt. And in the architecture of silence. Whether those qualify as ghosts, I leave to the poets." I raised my glass. "To the poets, then." He clinked his glass to mine. "And to those who remember what others try so hard to forget." That night, long after the fire had died down and Holmes had returned to his notes, I sat alone, reflecting. I thought of Eliza's first drawing, the one Cordelia found under the door. A distorted face. A black spiral where the ear should have been. Now, I understood. It wasn't madness she was drawing. It was what she had been made to hear and never speak of. A secret trapped so deep it twisted the shape of truth. Until it screamed for release. And the house. The house had listened. Weeks later, I received a letter. From Cordelia. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. Eliza has taken up gardening. She smiles sometimes. We even found one of Isabel's old ribbons tied to the rose bush by the pond. I think she left it there herself. The mirror remains in the west wing. I look into it sometimes. I don't see anything strange now. But I do see myself clearly. And sometimes I see her too. Not frightening. Just quiet. Just watching. Maybe that's all she ever wanted. Thank you. Cordelia Winfield. Holmes read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the spine of a book on his shelf, The Psychology of Memory. Will we ever go back? I asked. He looked out the window. No, he said. But part of us never left. In the cold mirror of Greystone Manor, a girl once waited for her name to be remembered. And now, finally, it had been. Isabel. The lady from the locked room. Not forgotten. Never again. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. And now I leave you with a question. If the truth asked you to break a silence that protected someone you loved, would you speak it?